Hello, everyone. My name is Melissa Wagner and your host for today. I'd like to welcome you to the U.S. Army webinar series, Digital Thread for Technical Authoring. And this is part 2 of a 4-part series. This webinar will be about 1 hour in length. So please enter your questions in the Q&A box. And after the presentations, we will get to those questions. If we miss your question or if we need more clarification, I do get a Q&A report, so we can always reach you offline to get those questions answered. Also, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted onto the Arbortext YouTube channel. I will be sending out an email once it is available. And for now, I'd like to go ahead and kick it off to Deb Williams, who's going to get things started for today.
All right. Thank you, Melissa. All right. So welcome to the U.S. Army webinar series. I did want to go through, this is a 4-part series, and the teams have been hard at work preparing all of this for you. As Melissa said, this is part 2. Last week on October 26th, and we did tape it and put it on YouTube. Last week, we worked on the 40,051 authoring. And this week, we're going to work on the illustrations and talk through illustrations in the digital thread. And both Ryan Lubin and Scott Thompson, so Ryan Lubin from GPSL and Scott Thompson from PTC will join and talk through this with you. And then next week, we will also join you about the digital thread for content management on November 9th. Come back and join us there. And then on November 16th, we're going to talk about the 40,051 content delivery through iAds and augmented reality. So we have a real full agenda and a lot of great webinar series. I would like to introduce the panel that's on the call today. So we do have Gary Bartlett from GPSL on the call. Ryan Lubin, Solution Architect from GPSL. Ryan will be presenting today. And then we have Scott Thompson is our Senior Pre-Sales from Arbortext. And then Dan Middlestat is also on the panel. Dan is a PTC solution consultant. And Alex Kaiser is on the call he is a solution consultant for augmented reality. So I just wanted to let you know who was on the panel. Please put your questions in the Q&A and anybody from the panel can help you. All right, so before I hand it off, we do have a special event that we're planning for. LiveWorks is coming in May, and PTC has announced online the dates. So LiveWorks will be May 15th to the 18th at the Boston Convention Center. And right now, planning is underway. Call for papers is open. And we would love to have you present and talk. It's best to hear from customers, and this is the time now to make that plan. So registration for LiveWorks will open up in mid-November, but the call for papers is open now, and that does close on November 18th. So we invite you to speak and be a thought leader and, present your ideas about what you've gone through here on the digital thread for Create, Manage, and Deliver. So, all right. So with that, I'm going to hand off to Scott to get us started.
Wonderful. Thank you, Deb. Can you hear me and see my screen?
Yes.
Wonderful. So today I'm going to present around the illustration tools that PTC offers. So we have 2 different tools, and to start that off, I have some presentation slides, and then we'll look at the tools themselves and some examples of how you can use illustrations. Of course, the entire idea behind the digital thread is that we can extend the use of, say, data, like CAD data, all the way through our illustration process and have controllable ways in that it would be updated or even published for viewing downstream. And then Ryan is going to go through a great example of how we can manage this even from a bill of material perspective and drive our parts list illustrations through the stored data in Windchill. So even more closely tied back to that source of digital thread. So think of me as the general overview and introduction, and starting with both of our illustration tools can leverage CAD data. So obviously the source 3D CAD data is highly accurate and is very beneficial for authors if they can use that as the direct representation of the real world objects. But we have a couple goals that we want to maintain in doing so. So first of all, we want to be able to link or update our illustrations as changes are made to the CAD. So we can certainly do that. And that introduces, again, that idea of if we have linked objects or we're using other data, we're building out that digital thread. So we need tools along the way that allow both the source of the information, say the CAD authors, as well as the illustrators to be able to see both sides of those linkages. And then our next goal here is that we want to provide illustrators an illustration-specific tool that's easy to use, that's familiar, that offers the type of functionality needed for creating illustrations that would be outside of, say, a heavy CAD application. And of course, in doing that, we want to protect those source 3D data sources so that changes made to them, say, on the illustration side, they're not affecting anything on the source data side. So the two PTC tools we have that accomplish these goals are Arbortext IsoDraw. And as the name implies, this is an isometric drawing tool that has a full suite of electronic drawing capabilities for draw from scratch type of examples. And I have this sample file. We'll take a look at it. This was actually just drawn using the tools in IsoDraw. A unique capability of IsoDraw is that it can still bring in a 3D source CAD object. You would then flatten it into 2D and then work with the additional drawing tools. So this is a long-standing tool. It is an excellent tool set that has seen quite a lot of use and continues to do so. A newer illustration tool in the PTC portfolio is Creo Illustrate, and this is intended as a three-dimensional environment for working with 3D source materials. So in Creo Illustrate, you would start with a complete CAD model, and you can work with that in an interactive 3D space, and meaning that you can also output three-dimensional viewables that could be used in things like augmented reality, or even creating something like an animation or even a 3D viewable that you might interact with, say, on a screen, are all possibilities using Creo Illustrate. So between the two tools, they seem like they might overlap, and they do in what they can output for their end outputs, but fundamentally they really have two different use cases. So IsoDraw has that full suite of 2D drawing tools, and it is limited to only two-dimensional output. So at its core, it's a 2D drawing tool. And then Creo Illustrate can also output two-dimensional graphics, but it is more closely tied to that CAD-based source. And actually in Creo Illustrate, I can only consume 3D geometry. I cannot author 3D geometry. And that's intended as this being downstream from the authoring perspective of the 3D. I'm leveraging that data, but I can still do functions like, in this sample here, create my exploded view. So the top graphic is created in IsoDraw, the bottom graphic was created in Creo Illustrate. So they can overlap in their outputs, but their use cases might be different depending on, say, if you need to open up existing 2D artwork and make changes. IsoDraw would be a great tool set. If you have 3D CAD, Creo Illustrate is a really friendly program to be able to use. A couple points here, and I'll show a little bit around this, is that both of these tools are fully integrated within Windchill, meaning that I can control all of the sources of my illustrations and the outputs of where my illustrations might be used, whether that's in, say, XML documentation or something like a parts catalog view that Ryan will show. I have controllability over all of those contexts. So I like to call them control points of, you do have control points from the downstream perspective of the illustrator, or even who might be downstream from there, say the parts catalog that's using an illustration, all the way back through to the CAD. So as changes are made, we are doing check-ins and check-outs, and everything is version controlled, stored in Windchill. So we will see this type of interaction in Ryan's demonstration. So what I wanted to focus on was just kind of an introduction to the tools themselves. But if you do have questions here around this, please feel free to ask. This is a topic of interest that we could certainly also schedule another session perhaps and spend more time on. So I will end my presentation with the file formats that can go into and out of the illustration tools. And if you would like these slides, please just let us know and we'd be happy to provide them. But for Creo Illustrate, it is able to import 3D geometry. So all of these formats here are 3D formats. Some of the PTC flavors here, for instance, the Creo view formats, we also have adapters that can go from formats that would not be on list to PVZ that could be read into Creo Illustrate. So you could think of that being extended, but these are all the direct file types that can be read directly into Creo Illustrate, and links can be maintained to them. So if they're updated in the future, you can update them appropriately in Creo Illustrate. And on the way out of Creo Illustrate for publishing, we can publish to 3D formats, 2D vector artwork, image formats, movie formats, as well as capture procedural information for Vuforia. So I'll do a quick example for what bringing in an illustration into Vuforia could look like, but there is a streamlined process for doing that on the Creo Illustrate export. For IsoDraw, IsoDraw can bring in 3D formats, 2D vector, and 2D raster. So that's what you're seeing here on this list. That is a lot of different file types. It's the only program I'm aware of that can do that. But some of the big ones would be things like CGM graphics and other existing 2D artwork we can open and work with inside of IsoDraw. And then on the output of IsoDraw, it would only be the 2D formats, whether 2D vector or 2D raster. And these are controllable through ISO profiles, or if you have a specific format, say for CGM for deliverables, IsoDraw has a large library of capabilities there. So I'll start with IsoDraw and give a little tour here. So this is that sample file I was mentioning that was actually hand drawn here in IsoDraw. And we can see here that, you know, I have my different layers and authoring tools that I can have. And the idea here is also that if I come in and let's say I grab a couple lines, we can make a new grid that will actually, let me make a new name. We can put this into a perspective that allows me to draw in the orientation of this artwork. So there's also tools for transforming from one perspective to the other, but you'll notice my camera is going to stay fixed to my workpiece. And now that I've aligned my grid, I could come in and draw in the same perspective that I'm seeing here. So for instance, right, if I wanted to, you know, extend out this into a 3D shape, I can come in and do that. And then I would have the abilities to, well, I could come in and trim up my lines, for instance, work with my fills and draw shapes and lines and other tools. So this is, again, just drawing type of functionality that I have here in IsoDraw. It's a really nice set of tools. There's perspective tools for laying out. Things like threads can easily be drawn, parallel lines, those types of things. And a really cool capability is I can also have my illustration be linked to a source 3D geometry. So right here, this is a .pvz file. That's PTC's lightweight 3D format, the Creo view format. And right now it is looking for an update to the 3D data for my 2D artwork. And in fact, if I want to, I can actually bring this into the 3D And when I do this, you'll notice my 2D tools are grayed out, and that's because I'm in the 3D edit mode. But I can grab on this part. I could change the color, for instance, if I wanted to. I can turn the parts on or off like I could with a layer. But let's say I wanted to do some more exploding of these parts. I can grab them. We can do the explosion. And then I can convert this back into 2D artwork to use the rest of my drawing tools. And so in that process, I can choose how I would like it to draw the lines and convert the 3D into the 2D. And once now back in the 2D perspective, I could then use the drawing tools here in IsoDraw. So in this tool, for instance, if I wanted to draw an explode line, I would draw the line, and then I can come in and we could do some trimming, for instance, to make that, appear like it is going through, the 3D geometry. So now I'm back in my line drawing mode, right? Which would allow me to come in and clean that up. So that's kind of a very quick tour here through IsoDraw. There are a ton of capabilities. Things like my balloons here are all controllable through editing. Text is a huge component here. I can create hotspot regions that would be selectable, meaning the text from this number 1 could highlight on my pick list in my graphic renderer. But here in IsoDraw, it gives me all of those capabilities for authoring. Moving over to Creo Illustrate, so here is actually the same source geometry. This is the same parking brake assembly, but now I'm looking at this in Creo Illustrate. So I'm in the 3-dimensional environment working with the 3D model. And in Creo Illustrate, I have the idea of creating multiple figures or individual illustrations. And so the Creo Illustrate project file itself would be this .c3di file. And it would contain or can contain as many number of figures or illustrations as you would like. It also, just like in IsoDraw, would contain the link to update the source geometry, and I can bring in multiple models in both tools. So if I wanted to bring in tooling or fixtures or even just other 3D reference geometry, you'll see in an example I have some tools, but you can load in other objects here. And then based on that, I can have any number of figures that could be created. And the figures might be things like an animation, which I'll show here in just a second. So in Creo Illustrate, we can work with the structure of these parts, and I can actually restructure them. So I made a couple assemblies here for myself in Creo Illustrate to easily turn on and off some of the hardware and bolts. And so I can make changes here. These changes are not being propagated to the CAD in any way. They're just changes here in my, you can see labeled as my illustration bill of material. But that's really handy, especially if you're working with a large assembly, or you might not be familiar with, say, the engineering part names. I can have access to rearrange that for myself as an illustrator. Speaking of the 3D information, all of the CAD attributes can become available here in Creo Illustrate. We can create parametric annotations that would look at this data. Say if I wanted a field for the material, if I wanted to have a call out, pull that off, or a torque value, all of that can come from the source 3D geometry. The position or home position of all of these parts is remembered and also editable here in Creo Illustrate. So if I wanted to, start making my exploded view, I can pull my parts out, and these parts are going to remember where they live. So I can tell it to go back to its home. Doing something like creating an explode line here is much simpler because it will actually draw that in the 3D. And if I wanted to grab, let's say, the seal and bring that out as well, that's going to be within the 3D bounds of that part. So I'm actually creating content within the 3D world. So this is a friendly tool to use, has lots of nice user features. Some examples we can do here in Creo Illustrate. Here is that example I was saying for, in this case, it's formatted for a page, right? I have a page size specified in case I'd like to output this in 2D and have it be controlled. But a couple examples here would be, We can have textures applied to parts. The colors of the parts are certainly editable as well. On the back face, let's say if we wanted to like select on this face and change the color of that, I can quickly and easily do that, right? And change maybe, you know, that's reference geometry or something that I'd like to point out within my animation. Here's an example of some of the tool library that is configurable here in Creo Illustrate. I have a logo applied to the 3D surface of the part. So some visual aspects here. One note, Creo Illustrate is not intended as our highly realistic rendering engine. We do have that as part of Creo Parametric. This, as the name implies, again, would be illustration purposes. A really common use case would be creating your parts catalog view. And this is just a hidden line removed view, but you can see here, I'm still in the 3D geometry. So this might be something that I may export for a 2D artwork, but I can have my callouts attached to the 3D geometry of these parts. So in my part viewer, I can select on the item and it would highlight, or the callout and it will highlight. And it's actually building an interactive list here in Creo Illustrate. And in Ryan's portion, he'll show how we can control this list from the wind chill side and actually then push the information into Creo Illustrate. But I can have this list. I could come into this list, and if I wanted to add that material value or torque spec or whatever other information might be at this part attribute level, I can have that populate here in Creo Illustrate as well. A couple more examples. Doing something like a section view is really, really easy to do. I can simply say that I want a section view and then dynamically move it through the model. And in this case here, I'm having it intersect with, well, we can add everything to that, or right, I could remove items as I see fit for my whatever I'm trying to detail or show. So again, just a friendly program to be able to use and come in. And of course, this can be exported in a 3D configuration so the end user can actually interact with and see the model in a 3D viewer as well. One really powerful capability of Creo Illustrate is I can animate parts, and I can do that in what's called a sequence here in Creo Illustrate. And this gives me stepped animations that build upon each other. So if we wanted to look at this in the renderer, so we'll play through it, we can see here it's pretty simple, right? I'm showing some color changes, some parts unscrewing, right? So this could be a disassembly procedure. But the cool thing is that I've captured that in the 3D space. So if I want to play this back in an orientation, in whatever orientation, that can be remembered and then played back. And that's the type of idea for if we're delivering this to, say, augmented viewing, we can have it render in the 3D space, and your camera position or your eyewear position would then play that back. We can also capture the camera position too in Creo Illustrate if we wanted to output, say, a movie file as well. That's totally appropriate as well. So that's a quick view at some of the tools themselves. In terms of some examples for how these might be used, I have a couple. One is within an XML document, and this is just a quick example of showing multiple figures within a document, and all of these are going to be based on the same illustration file. So you can see here this 16713 that contains all of these different graphics, and they can be interactive in 3D in the XML. This is a topic and a data topic, and if you're curious on the definition or the tag types here, but all of this is going to be remembered, and the figures where these are used, the illustrations themselves, the where used nature is of course known when we store this inside of Windchill. So we can have reusable illustrations. The source of those files coming from the CAD perspective is controllable, and then even referencing them here in, say, the XML, I might reference the 3D. So if this is published to a 3D environment, it could be interactive. If it's going to something like a PDF, it could be converted into an image during the publishing process as well. So an example here would be, this is the illustration file itself in Windchill, and we are looking at the upside down where used tree, and I can see that it's used in each one of these figures and where the location that figure is being used. So just to point out, all of this information is being stored. I can see the synchronized versions, the latest versions, and changes made to this, of course, then I can see everywhere changing this illustration might affect. My last example here would be going in and just a really simple example for building out a experience in Vuforia Studio. So this would be an augmented reality experience. And very simply, I can come in and we can upload my output from my illustration that we were just looking at. So here is we now have my model in the 3D space. And let's go ahead and I'll choose that sequence that I made. And then on my 2D overlay for my controls, let me make a button, and we'll call this the play button. And here in Vuforia, it's very simple to come in and interact things. So I'm saying, and when I click on this, I'm dragging this onto the 3D model and saying that I want that play button to do a play function for that model. And if we do a preview here, so I've taken the output of Creo Illustrate and put it into an experience here for viewing. So if we go and preview this, so now I'm in the 3D world here, and in the real world, if I were to publish this, I could look at it on my iPad and I would be walking around the 3D space where this model is being loaded. But here's my little play button I created. And if I hit play on that, we'll see my animation and how I created that, right? So here's my bolts unscrewing, and then it will pause, and then I can come back and go on to my next step. And the really handy thing with these sequences is, let's say I forgot to do something in Creo Illustrate on the authoring side, I can come back and say, actually in step 1 at the very end, let's say we wanted maybe this part to change color. Well, I can come in and say, well, let's do a color change, and let's have this turn, let's say yellow. And you'll notice here when I hit OK, it will propagate to all of my subsequent steps. So these are going to re-render. And then you can see here at the start of step 2, that's going to be yellow. And it added to my little timeline here a color change event for this part. So actually, if I wanted it to turn yellow in the middle of my animation, I can do that. And then as we play back, it will now turn yellow, right, along with my other animation. And then here in step 2, it will remain yellow. So this is really nice to use. I can rearrange these steps. If I forgot to do something or I need to add to it in the future, it's really handy to be able to come in and work with that in a sequential timeline. Great. That is everything I had hoped to show. I do see there are a couple questions that we will circle back to at the end, but I will hand it off to Ryan.
All right, thanks, Scott. Go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so what I'll be demonstrating today is generating similar illustrations to what Scott just demonstrated, but doing that directly from a parts list in Windchill. I should also mention that just for the sake of time, I did pre-record this demo just so there was no dead air, but let me go ahead and start this. So what we're looking at here is a parts list in Windchill. And so the first thing I'll show you is that you can see this parts list is associated with a bill of material. So in this case, it's a service bill of material. But a parts list could easily be associated with an engineering bill of material, logistics bill of material, any type of bill of material. And those bill of materials can all be derived from one another. So upstream, downstream bills of material. So you can see that bill of material had some CAD data associated with it. So now going back to our parts list, all of the parts that we pulled in from that bill of material, you can see them in our parts list here, and each of those have an item number assigned to them automatically. So now if we go and we generate an illustration from our parts list, you can see that the template we've selected is Creo Illustrate, so it will generate that C3DI file that Scott was just showing you in Creo Illustrate directly off of our parts list. So I'll go ahead and give that C3DI file a name and click Finish. So this can take several minutes in the background, but once it's done, it will allow you to open that up within Creo Illustrate directly from Windchill. And you can see on the left in our parts list, we also have that C3DI associated with our parts list structure. So now it's launched Creo Illustrate. It's prompting us to log into Windchill from Creo Illustrate. And from here, once it opens, you can see we have the basis of our illustration, so we can go ahead and start building out our figures. So I'll go ahead and first thing I'll do is I'll create a new figure. Like Scott mentioned, you can have multiple figures within the same C3DI file. So if you have a parts list or a ripstol that has multiple sheets associated with it, you can generate all of those sheets off of the same C3DI file and then export them to whichever file format you want, and then associate those back to the parts list. I'll demonstrate that a little bit later. So once I've got my illustration opened up in Creo Illustrate, I can do things like reorient it. A lot of the things that Scott demonstrated previously. So I'll go ahead and reposition it. You can also do things like, so if we go over to the figure tab, we can change render mode so we can have it display differently. So it's the same 3D illustration, just rendering it differently. We can have it display as a line art. So several different render modes. And then from here, we can go ahead and add our callouts back in. We can also, so go ahead and add our callouts back in. There's a number of different callouts to choose from. And these callouts, the numbers are all derived from the parts list that we generated on the Windchill side. So again, I'm adding the callouts back in. Those numbers came directly from the parts list. Once I've added my callouts, I can reposition those. So I can move my callouts around. And then from here, I can start exploding out different parts. So I'll go ahead and create my exploded view. All right, and then once I'm done with that, I'll just go ahead and clean out my callouts a little bit more. finish repositioning them. All right, and then once I've finished exploding my parts, created or moved my callouts, and I'm happy with my illustration, at this point, I can go ahead and actually I can do other things like creating sections. But once I'm happy with the illustration, I can go ahead and save that. And then I'll go ahead and check it back into Windchill. So you can see here the callouts, especially with 40,051, typically you start from the 11 o'clock position and number around from there. So that's one of the things I'll demonstrate next is how to change those callouts from the parts list itself. So now that I've checked, now that I've saved my illustration, checked it back into Windchill. So now you can see it's publishing that PVZ file and uploading it back to Windchill. And then once it's done uploading, I can close it out from Creo Illustrate. So now if I go back to my parts list, again, you can see that the C3DI file is associated with my parts list. And from here, if I go back and I start renumbering all of my items, so again, starting from the 11 o'clock position, I can go back and renumber each of those items. In addition to changing the item number, you can also modify other attributes on the parts list items here, such as serviceability or whether or not the item is illustrated. So for example, if you want something or if you want an item to not display the callout, you could flag that as non-serviceable or illustrated equals no. And that will impact how it displays on the Creo Illustrate side. So the serviceable attribute, as well as things like quantity, those are inherited from the bill of material that the parts list was originally generated off of, but you can modify that within the parts list itself, which wouldn't have a bearing on the service BOM. But if, for example, you did want to have a different quantity displayed in your parts list, you could change it here. Again, also the serviceable attribute, that's also inherited from the bill of material or the part itself, but you can modify that within the parts list. So we'll set some of these to serviceable equals no, which again will remove the call out from our parts list or from our illustration. So we'll go ahead and flag some of these as no. Once we've updated our item numbers and our serviceability flag, that point, we can check our parts list back in. Okay, so we've renumbered our parts list items. Go ahead and save that view. And then at this point, we can check our parts list back in. And now that our parts list has been updated and the item numbers have been changed, we can actually update our C3DI file. So if I go to the C3DI from the parts list and select Update Illustration, it's going to take that same C3DI file and update those item numbers. So it'll maintain the same positioning and everything that we've already done, but it's now going back and updating those item numbers. So now if I open the C3DI file again in Creo Illustrate, now you can see it's telling us that the PVZ was updated, and now our illustration has also been updated. And so now it's renumbered all of those callouts starting from the 11 o'clock position. Another thing we can do from the parts list itself is we can generate an IsoDraw illustration. So from the same parts list, we can create our IsoDraw file. So go ahead and give that a name. And now this time it's prompting us to open it up from Windchill within IsoDraw. And so now you can see we have the basis for our IsoDraw illustration using that same, CAD visualization information. So that would be creating an IsoDraw illustration from the parts list. The final thing we can do is we can associate an illustration created outside of Creo Illustrate, so not from the parts list directly. So let's say we have our own 2D illustration sitting out there that we want to associate with the parts list. We can search for that within Windchill, and then we can associate that illustration as well. So once I've associated my illustration, I'll go ahead and check that back in. And then the final thing I'll demonstrate that isn't necessarily It isn't necessarily related to the illustrations, but it does demonstrate what happens if there's an upstream change to the bill of material that the parts list was generated off of. So going back to my service bill of material that I used to generate my parts list, if there are any upstream changes to this bill of material, for example, if I go in and I change a quantity on one of the items in my bill of material. So if I change the quantity on this item from 7 to 8, go ahead and update my, or check my bill of material back in. Now, if I go back to my parts list, you can see that Windchill has flagged this part list as needing an update. And it gives me the option to either remove the update required flag so I can ignore that change, or I can update the parts list. So that would bring the parts list in alignment with the service bill material. All right, so that's generating illustrations off of a parts list in Windchill.